Mother Spirit Awaits. The DMT trip report by a Universal Shaman. Posted to irwid.org, September 28, 2004. It's been a few weeks now since my first encounter with DMT, something long awaited and highly anticipated, but which completely transcended any expectations I had of it. I'd read a lot of McKenna's rants about self-transforming machine elves, the Amazon shamans helping spirits and ancestors, and friends had told me about gnomes in giant stat cats running around in a fully psychedelic playground. No matter how much I heard about the alien intelligence encounters, I kept putting them aside as interpretations that colour and play off of each other. Like one person says they encountered aliens, and so the next person interprets their own trip in a similar way, which creates a chain of influence over every next tripper. However, I did expect something alien, something that I could recognise as alien, something sci-fi or fantastical, like a psychedelic Star Trek. I couldn't have been further from the fact of the matter. I was at a friend's house organising some other drug-related circumstances. It came up that he had a bit of DMT left and asked me if I was interested in trying some. Absolutely not. So we got in the car and drove to a place he recommended tripping at. Up in the hills, in a national park, which was a 5-minute walk through a scrub into a secluded forest area. During the walk we talked about the feeling of the place, noting that there was a distinct pagan ritual site feel about the area, a kind of overarching, all-seeing watchful presence about the environment. It was peaceful, clear-skied, and fairly shady and cool. In retrospect, I'm sure this comfortable place influenced the quality of the DMT flash. I had 2 attempts about 15 minutes apart, because the first was noticeably not a peak experience, but was a good introduction to the totally alien nature of the DMT visions. Taking in the first toke, around 25 milligrams, I began to notice weird body sensations. My trunk became slightly elongated, and everything was surging with an energy that was totally silent to the ears, like a raging river in my mind. My heart felt like it was about to burst through my ribcage as I reached the peak of the inhalation. I let out a single laugh as I began to exhale, partly because the sensations were awesome, not unlike the body rushes of mushrooms, but it was mostly just ecstatic that DMT molecules were finally having their way with my mind. I closed my eyes and was immediately face to face with a supreme being of sorts. It had no face, and its form was like a string of multicoloured lights constantly morphing, like a clown making a series of balloon animals, beginning with a dog, which he then alters a couple of parts of, holds it differently to reveal a dolphin, and so on and so forth. It was certainly a living presence, and without a face it was still somehow staring eye to eye with me as though it knew everything about my entire life. There was no sense of emotional attachment, but there was definitely a supralinguistic communication happening. This being and I were travelling at great speed through an infinite stretch of deep space. I was chasing it. It stayed the same distance away from me the whole time and seemed to be at ease with the speed, while I was struggling to keep up. It was as though it wanted me there, but not yet. Not in this way. It was telling me to come back when I could keep up with it, when I could catch up and pass straight through. Maybe this was the membrane that separates the being's world of mine, the chrysanthemum that McKenna described. The being zoomed away and the effects started to fade, leaving me in a blissful kind of luminescent state that surpassed any notion of Zen states or meditative bliss. The real world had become indescribably fresh and crystal clear, all while I had my eyes closed. And 15 minutes later, the second attempt was around twice the dose of the first, which began just the same, the visual environment becoming kind of fuzzy and my body seemed to be spaghettifying just slightly. But within seconds of this, there was a distinct difference. I'd only heard this described in other people's accounts once, I think, and I'd totally forgotten about the possibility of it happening until it actually happened to me. So just after I released the toke, I looked around to see what was happening to my senses as I was coming up, when the entire universe began to buzz. It was like a deep bass feedback loop that you sometimes hear in electronic music, like the humming noise of flying saucers in movies that's very electronic and computer-like. But it was unbelievably real and right there, all around me. I immediately thought that the DMT had unlocked a whole new realm of sound that we don't normally hear. A background kind of sound that would distract our ears from normal functioning. the sound that matter makes. I've perceived the vibrations of matter and subatomic particles on other trips, such as mushrooms and acid, and once or twice even on the old hooch. But now with DMT, it was a totally audible reality. And more than just audible, this sharp bassy hum that was coming out of everything made everything vibrate, including myself and my sitter next to me. It was so intense and pervasive that I had to close my eyes to escape the motion sickness of this vibrating mass of existence. When I did, the buzz began to mutate and break up into all these telephonic, electronic modem-like noises, like a kaleidoscope of sound. The sounds built and built, reaching a peak that culminated in a vortex, which sucked everything in existence, the buzzing, the environment around me, and my entire being into a totally foreign dimension. And there I was, with total silence. The buzzing was gone, and I was in a room looking at a wall. The wall was like a complete scaffold of constantly morphing angular prisms, shimmering with colours that are completely beyond the descriptions of any language, and totally awe-inspiring. I felt an uncontrollable smile grow across my face. Reality check. But I kept watching. I immediately noticed that there was something more than just a wall. I noticed at first there was something in the wall popping out occasionally to show me it was there. It wanted me to recognise it before it would fully come out though. It was something like watching the flat surface of a calm beach and seeing a dolphin periodically break the surface for air. When I recognised that there was definitely something living, swimming through this scaffold of unbelievable shapes and colours, it finally came out. It was a non-human female being, flying around this hyperdimensional room of sorts. She wore a flowing cape or gown that streamed directly off a big round glowing face, the kind of face that a 3-year-old kid draws, a circle with dots for eyes and a curved line for a mouth. And that's really all there was of her. But her face was so alive, so compassionate, and so enlightened. She was very happy when I realised she was there as well. Then, I watched as a pedestal literally grew out of the floor of this room, made of the same unearthly super brilliant scaffolding. My attention must have been distracted by this thing growing out of the ground, because the female being got in my face and communicated to me, not in words I might add. Look at what's on the pedestal. I looked up and saw a diamond-shaped object that was made of similar stuff to the walls, but infinitely more brilliant, more dazzling, more unspeakably awesome. And as my smile grew, total awe and amazement filled me, and this female being began flying around the object at great speed, keeping her eyes fixed on me the whole time. She was doing flips and sharp turns and cheering as though she was celebrating the fact that she had the chance to show me whatever this was. She kept communicating to me. Look at it, isn't this awesome? This continued, and I kept my eyes on that unbelievable object as the scene began to fade. I started to become aware of my hands folded in my lap. They were slightly sweaty, and my body was on an up and full of energy, just as my mind began to return to the reality of sitting in a forest setting, next to the person who had just initiated me into yet another, but easily the most awesome, dimension of conscious reality. I was left feeling unusually happy for at least a week after that experience. It has also left me with a profound sense of fulfillment and far greater purpose and perspective in my life's quest to understand the nature of this human existence. From these experiences, I have to say that DMT is quite patently the most accessible of the deep psychedelic states, and in terms of the practical, empirical analysis of one's own shamanic journeys, this is by far the easiest landscape to traverse that I've encountered. Mushrooms require a huge amount of dedication and spiritual preparation, weeks and months for the most rewarding outcomes. They also require massive amounts of attention, a great deal of energy to keep myself at least partly detached from the emotional roller coasters that the mushroom state can draw me into. And this is particularly because of the extended time of the trips. The same goes for powerful acid experiences and other indole hallucinogens. I say this not because DMT is so short-acting, but because on a proper dose of DMT, one's being is thrust into a peak experience. There really is no choice in the matter. On mushrooms or acid, one must guide his or her own thoughts and emotions through precarious unknown landscapes, and even then a peak experience is not guaranteed. DMT, however, seems to serve a peak experience on a platter with a salad on the side. I knew from the moment I started toking to when I found myself in another dimensional room. I knew this was right. The DMT wanted me there, and it took me there. All I had to do was receive it graciously. Blue by You, a DMT trip report by Blue Boy, posted to irwid.org, March 21st, 2004. So several years ago, I experimented with DMT. I was introduced to this chemical through a friend of mine who is heavily into shamanism. Over a 12-month period, I smoked it 4 times with ever-increasing doses. My friend recommended that I work my way up to the spirit dose. Now, this was wise because even in smaller doses, it can be a frightening experience. But on my 5th journey, I finally found them. Or more accurately, they found me. I've since read accounts from McKenna and Strassman's subjects. I guess my experience was similar, though I didn't perceive myself as being inside a structure. Rather, it seemed that the spirits were all around me. Wherever I looked, the swirling patterns transmogrified into these oscillating things which clearly acted independently of my own thoughts. At least that was the overwhelming perception I had. I can't really describe them. They were infinite in their complexity. I can see why people are convinced that they are entities separate from their own minds. It's inconceivable that anyone can imagine such. I don't know what you'd actually call them, or it. Anyway, I was there, wherever the hell that was, and all of a sudden each one of my fingers was connected to a spirit. So here's where it gets really strange. There were thousands of them near me now, and millions in the distance. Though if I looked at the distant ones, they then zoomed up close. So the next thing I know, each hand has thousands of fingers on them. I had complete control over each one as well. A bit like how I can move our left index finger, I could completely control left finger 40,624. It was like I was a conductor of sorts. They were dancing and flying around in accordance with what I did with my super hands. Sound and sight would merge and shift. I was quite literally conducting an orchestra of millions. There was a lot of other stuff too, but I've never been able to recall it. My final memories being in absolute nothingness except for one spirit. As I looked at it, it started to oscillate, so I was looking at myself, or what I perceived was myself. I was changing form 1,000 times a second. The oscillations became faster and the spirit wanted to know who it was. Now, this wasn't asked in words, but I knew what the question was, somehow. Well, I don't know, I said. This conversation went back and forth at an ever greater speed, until at the same time we were both saying, "He is you, he is you," and then the words would converge into just Hugh. Literally, it was blue. I mean, I became the colour blue itself. It was a psychedelic play on words. I was a frequency. And then this spirit rushed up to the room from me from the other side of the galaxy, laughing. He had a present, like a normal box with a blue ribbon, and he said, "What's your favourite hue?" So next thing I knew, I'd opened my eyes. The extra freaky element was that I had turned my head around and was looking straight out the window at, well, you guessed it, a big clear blue sky. Now, once I'd met them, or myself, perhaps, well, I certainly don't ascribe to the literal idea that DMT is conducive to contacting aliens. Well, after all this, I decided not to do DMT again. I've experienced total and absolute fucking out there, and I'd be scared that if I did it again, I wouldn't quite make it back entirely. I don't think that there could be a more intense experience imaginable. However, I never imagined I'd experience what I did either. It is amazing, but a word of caution. This isn't a fun party drug at all. Some people want to go skydiving, and that's cool, but this was like being a Super Bowl bouncing around the universe itself. At the time of going through all this, it really was too much. And the final freakiness? At certain times of the morning or afternoon, I'd look up at the sky and get this deja vu feeling. It's just the right shade of blue. Observed and observer melded together. A DMT trip report by Megan, posted to earwid.org June 14th, 2021. So after 20 years of desperately wanting to try the mysterious and elusive DMT, I finally figured out how to obtain some. The package arrived and I fished out a small baggie of light yellow powder. Interestingly, I was expecting it to be white. I immediately tested it. All good, thankfully. So I weighed it out and put all but my 50mg dose into a glass jar, since I heard that plastic could degrade the substance if left in too long. I lacked the correct smoking setup, so I resorted to the sandwich method of layering the powder between ashes in my regular glass weed bowl. I was satisfied that everything was ready and rushed to my bedroom in excitement. This was it. The day had finally arrived. Was I going to meet the famous machine elves? Was I going to astrally fly to outer space? Or was I going to learn the secrets of the universe? Well, either way, I couldn't wait to find out. It was early evening and dark outside. I turned on low ambient lighting, switched off my phone and laid on my bed. The room was entirely silent. I was full of anticipation and a bit of trepidation. I flicked the lighter and took care to only lightly touch the top layer of ash as to vaporize the powder. I took a deep drag and automatically tried to stem the rising smoke from the bowl before I was ready to take the second hit. The effects hit me like a freight train within 2 to 3 seconds in a most unexpected manner. My surroundings exploded into a bright fractal that reminded me of colourful Hindu-type designs. I also felt this light body load sweep over me that seemed to originate from the upper chest. Shocked, I hurried to take the second hit, worried that I would become too impaired to operate the pipe if I waited a moment longer. I never did quite make it to the intended third hit. My consciousness had left the building completely by that point. But I did enter what I can only describe as a waking dreamlike state. I didn't feel the sensation leaving my body. I just seamlessly blipped into another reality entirely. There was nothing notable or distinctive about this place though. My previous reality was instantly forgotten, although I retained a measure of ability to form distinctive thoughts. Was this some sort of waiting area or holding room? In contrast to the brightly pulsating fractals from moments earlier, I now only saw a whitish grey fog everywhere. I was also keenly aware of a benevolent or perhaps neutral entity leaning over me, looking down on me, calmly inspecting me. I couldn't quite make out any distinct features, and the entity did not speak to me really. But I felt completely calm, patient, and a bit curious as to what it was doing. I understood only after the trip was done that this was the gatekeeper who would direct my journey, because I soon blipped again and everything changed drastically a second time. So then the ability to form thoughts dissolved away. I was no longer me, and it didn't matter because I'd forgotten about me. Well, forgot is a poor description, because that indicates mental faculties to begin with, and I had none. I was no longer a person, and had no concept or care of what a person even was. I also had no human emotions, and no human thoughts. All that really existed was a deep sense of peace and contentment. It was the ultimate, ideal state of being. In other words, the awareness that was once me was individually conscious, but very much not an individual. Now, this was clearly ego death, and probably something even far beyond that. People sometimes describe ego death as terrifying, but how can you be terrified if you're no longer a being that experiences human emotions? So you know what, I'm not quite sure what this was at all, aside from a complete 100% transformation. The transition from a complicated and chaotic human individual to a simple electrical charge was smooth and seamless. I peacefully existed as an energetic building block of whatever plane of existence I was transported to, and it was perfect. Time didn't exist here, and my awareness had always been there and always would be. My very essence undulated and flowed this way and that, weightless, and riding invisible waves over vast, vast distances. I just quietly dwelt, devoid of thought, and in a state of bliss for all of eternity. There were no entities here, just as I was not an entity. It was nothing but a perfect, fluidly shifting and endless sea of harmoniously vibrating energy. So as the DMT began to wear off, I gradually became aware of my human body. What? I gasped, and my hand flew up and touched my face. Oh no. This was my first thought. I was thinking again, and it was weird and jarring. It was something like being woken from a peaceful sleep by someone rudely dumping a bucket of ice water on your bed, but 1,000 times worse. Then, sobering up very swiftly, I remembered everything. My human life on Earth. I was Megan. I remembered her now. I'd taken drugs? No, this was such a cruel development. This wasn't fair at all. My real life was back there, in the blissful sea. To say that being suddenly burdened with human consciousness again was a disappointment would be the understatement of the millennia. It may sound like I'm a normally depressed person, or that I hate myself or something, the way I describe my great sadness and sense of loss at returning to my human self. But honestly, that isn't the case. It's key to the story to include that. In all honesty, my life isn't any more horrible than the average person's. In retrospect, I find it quite curious that transitioning into a bolt of electricity was seamless and unnoticeable, but transitioning back to what's supposed to be my normal self felt unnatural, to the point of minor impending doom. It was also hard to wrap my head around the fact that I'd only been out for 10 minutes, as opposed to the feeling of timelessness I experienced in the sea of harmony. I truly cannot wait to go back, but I know instinctively that it's not something that should be done casually or for mere escapism. I respect it far too much for that. I have no doubt that I was in a real place that exists somewhere out there, but I'm not sure if DMT is for everyone. What I mean by this is if you're looking to party and get lit, this is really not the right substance for that, and I could see it going sideways pretty badly if someone went into it with that mindset, as the gatekeeper may not take it very kindly.